Alright, in this video I'm going to do a coolant change, and then I'm going to discuss many of the causes for overheating and ways you can troubleshoot that and or hopefully resolve those issues. I've had a few people ask me about doing this video in comments on other videos that I've done, specifically requesting this. So I thought I would shoot this while I was doing it, and here we are. So you notice all the plastics are off. It's just so much easier to do all this with the plastics off. It gives you better visibility. And if you haven't seen already, I have a video showing you how to take all the plastics off in about 10 minutes, the video is, for this 1999 Sportsman 500 and similar. Before I took the plastics off, this is what it looked like, so you can see that you really wouldn't be able to get at much other than the radiator cap. Well, I guess you'd be able to get at some of the other stuff. It just makes it so much easier for you to inspect your radiator, straighten out the fins, get rid of mud, things like that. But before I took the plastics off, this is what you were dealing with. So real quick, just to show you what you're dealing with here, I mean, just to even get at the radiator cap on these, you know, at bare minimum, you need to remove this front rack, and that's just 4 bolts off. You might have a slightly different configuration on yours, other, I don't know, bells and whistles that may need to be addressed. Then, you know, obviously, I've got some of this on there. I got a couple bits loose here, so I'm kind of forcing that out of there. You know, my bezel around my headlights partly undone and stuff. I got a few other things going. So you can see you got your radiator cap, you got your inlet and outlet hose from the radiator. A lot of wheelers have one of the hoses out of the bottom of the radiator. On this one, that's not the case. But anyway, so that's really all you have access there, you know, and some wiring. You know, this is your sensor for your fan, temperature sensor. I'll get into all that more once I'm going to flip back over to with all the plastics off. And again, if you're wondering about getting the plastics off, I have a video where I take them all off, the entire machine, in about 10 minutes if you want to see about that. It just makes everything so much more accessible, and if you have some downtime, you know, it's kind of inspiring to see everything and see how easy it is to get at stuff with the plastics off, and you might be more inclined to do a bunch of things that you were maybe putting off or that weren't so convenient. So back to plastics off. All right, so as you can see, back to plastics off mode. I got this big pan that I mix concrete up in. In fact, another video that I just posted of a project I was doing that I used it for. Draining your antifreeze is pretty messy, as anyone who's done it knows, or watched someone that's done it knows. So, I mean, that's overkill, but chances of me having to clean up the floor after are pretty slim. So, first thing I'm going to do, assuming you're not troubleshooting overheating issues and things of that nature, but I am going to cover that. I'm going to talk about a lot of common problems with that in between, and then at the end I'll kind of summarize. But I've had a few people on other videos in the comments ask me if I would do a video on this, and I searched to make sure there wasn't already 1,000 of them on there, and I only got a few results, and you know, some are more thorough than others, some cover very specific things, so I'm going to try to kind of bullet point a lot of the topics all into one, if that, and hopefully that'll be helpful to everybody. Again, I'm not an expert. I learn as I go a lot of stuff. Always learning something. When you're not learning, you're dead. That's the way I look at it. And I'll just cover the stuff the best that I know from my own personal experiences, and hopefully it's helpful. So first thing I'm going to do, and assuming you're not, again, that you're not troubleshooting other problems, and I will cover some of those common problems, taking off my cap. And again, this is a 1999 Polaris Sportsman 500. You know, the approach to it might be slightly different on others, some of the connections, etc. You know, for example, on this one you got an inlet and an outlet hose on top, whereas on a lot of them, you come down underneath over here, and that's one of your hoses is hooked up to here, and that's what you would disconnect to drain. I have a drain plug on mine, which, you know, is good or bad depending on who's watching the video. If you got a drain plug, that's probably good because it's the same thing. So I'm just going to get that going, get that start draining a little bit here, or a lot of it, as soon as that plug popped out. And I took the plug all the way out. I've always, my recollection of plugs like that in the past is I thought you could get it to a certain point and it would start draining out the middle, but that's not the case with this one. So, you know, it's not open to the back side. So, you may just have a nut in there without the fancy handle to pull it out. So that's draining my, again, like I said, my cap's off. And I'm going to go over some of the other parts. Your coolant system consists of a few different parts. Obviously your radiator, you have a fan behind it typically. You got your water pump, which is around the side here. Typically in this area, this location, you know, your inlet, outlet, sucking coolant in, pumping it through the motor, and then returning to the radiator to be cooled, if all is functioning properly. Then, over on the other side, you have this model has a thermostat, and that's under here. And normally I would dive in and pop that off and show you, but if you're troubleshooting and thinking about a thermostat, you're likely well versed in that and capable of doing that. And I don't want to have to go get another gasket and all that stuff, or put RTV or, you know, some sort of sealant on there just for demonstration purposes. Like, again, sometimes I do that, but I'm not going to on this one. So it's just 2 bolts, pop that off. You can test your thermostat if you like, or just put a new one in, up to you. And I'll get into how to test one and stuff like that a little later. This is your temperature sensor. If your temperature light or check engine light is on your dash, that is what regulates that. And I'll get into that as well, troubleshooting that if that's a problem a little later in the video here once I'm done cleaning this out and see what else. So on this side, along with your thermostat and heat sensor, you have your overflow reservoir. And what that does is you have the radiator cap with a pressure relief valve on it. Basically, as the coolant expands, it needs to go somewhere instead of exploding your radiator, and it comes through a hose to the overflow reservoir. As things cool, it sucks it back into the radiator, all being regulated by that cap. When things get hot, the cap opens, allowing coolant out into the overflow, and then when things cool, the cap goes back into position, allowing that coolant to be sucked back in as needed and back and forth. So that's what that is. Fan sensor on mine is here. On some, it's down there where I pulled my plug out, or on the other side on the bottom where I pulled my plug out. But you know, you got your wiring, there's a sensor there that's threaded in, and if that's bad, you know, your fan's not going to work. And I'll get into troubleshooting that as well, so you can determine if that's helpful. So that's pretty much all of it, you know, as far as the system goes. Just the basic stuff to troubleshoot if you're trying to sort out some issues. But for now, I'm going to clean this out and then refill it, talk about burping out the air, and then after that, I'll troubleshoot overheating problems if that's your interest in why you're here. Okay, and one other thing I didn't cover, sorry about that, just hop backwards here, is I took out the bottom bolt there. Some people do that. I've seen over the years. I've never really had a conversation about the thought process of just taking out the bottom one. It doesn't seem to be a drain or anything, at least on this design. Maybe on some it is. I personally haven't seen it. So I took that bottom one out and I cracked the 2 side ones, and that kind of, I guess, separates the gasket a little bit. Maybe I'll even do the top one. I'm not going to take it all off the water pump. And again, this is the water pump. I'm just loosening that so it can drain out any residual coolant from within the pump itself. And, you know, the lines, I may disconnect this line and lift it up to gravity, drain it. So I'm going to let this stuff drain out and get everything put back together, put the plug back in, and then we'll fill it up, and I'll talk about burping the system. And then we will talk about troubleshooting some of the overheating issues and ways you can test the components to determine if that's what's causing your issues. And another little tip before I fill everything back up, I'm going to flush everything out, well, the radiator. I'm just going to fill up the radiator with distilled water. Do not use your hose, do not use tap water. Tap water has particulates, minerals, things, sediments in it that can potentially cause buildup and or damage, corrosion in your system, and then, you know, cause the other problems like maybe need a new radiator or something down the road. So distilled water is very cheap, grocery store by the gallon. It's like $1 something a gallon. Probably cheaper, it's probably harder to make than when you buy filtered water. More of a process, but it's cheaper. If you grab a jug of just, you know, drinking water, purified water off the shelf, it's probably more expensive than this. I was just killing one of the bottles I had there. So again, don't use tap water, use distilled water, and I'm just dumping it through. The stuff coming out of here is pristine, like good enough that it could probably just be put right back in. I would never do that, of course, but it's probably of the same caliber. So I'm just pouring this through to kind of flush out the radiator before I put the caps back on, and while letting the water pump dribble out and stuff, and then we'll tighten everything back up, and then we'll put in the coolant. And your coolant should be 60-40 or 50-50 mix, meaning coolant and distilled water. 60 coolant, 40 distilled water, or 50-50 coolant water. Distilled water again, don't use tap water. So I'm just kind of letting this trickle through and clean it out. And you know, I don't always do this. Might be overkill. Certainly draining the fluid and putting new fluid in without doing any other steps is certainly still beneficial compared to doing nothing. But again, I'm just doing this. I tend to overkill on some stuff. I could put the plugs in, fill it up with water, and just run it for a short period of time and then shut it off and drain it again, but I'm not going to go to that extreme. You certainly can. I certainly have in other occasions, but I'll just give you that option to do. I'm just not doing it this time. So half a gallon I poured through there, plus part of another one. I'm going to call that good for just flushing it out a little bit. And then we'll, once it's done dribbling, we'll refill and talk about that. Decided while I'm letting that dribble, I'll make the best of my time here and kind of go over some of the stuff. So if you're having overheating problems, it can be a common frustrating thing, especially if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you start having some issues. If it does happen just randomly out in the middle of nowhere, one of the most common things for that is if you've been riding through mud puddles and stuff, your radiator gets plugged up with mud and everything, or maybe you hit something and it bent a bunch of fins, or I guess the most obvious thing to look for first of all is any leaks anywhere. You know, check all your connections, check your water pump, make sure there's no coolant leaking out. Obviously you don't want to pop your cap off while everything's hot. But if you're having just a mystery overheating problem, you know, check for leaks. Then when it's cool enough, of course, check your coolant level, but that level could have likely went down because of the overheating. A couple of symptoms of that, other than the engine temperature light or check engine light coming on your dash. Say for example, if you have coolant squirting out the top of your pressure relief valve that's on the overflow container, that means things are getting so hot that it's ran out of places to go. It's filled this and now it has to still relieve itself and it keeps squirting out. That means things are not cooling properly, and that can be from a few different things, and they all kind of repeat each other. You know, the symptoms are kind of repetitive. You know, I'll start on this side and then I'll go one by one through that. I'm kind of hopping all over the place, I apologize. So if you take your radiator cap off and you're running it and you never see the coolant level change, could be a thermostat problem. You know, if it never opens up to allow the exchange of hot and cooler coolant, you know, that could be a thermostat problem. If your temperature light is always on and you just don't get it, everything seems to be working okay, it doesn't seem to be overheating, you've run it with the cap off, you see fluid exchange, this sensor may be bad. You know, if you turn on your key and you start it fresh, first thing, hasn't run in hours, days, weeks, and the temperature light is on immediately before, you know, it could have even had a chance to get up to operating temperature, much less hot, this is potentially your culprit. You know, and that's simple. It's a wire going up to the you know, the console up there, and just, you know, thread it out, put a new one in. It's my understanding that you need to drain your coolant before doing that, or it'll drain out of there and then you might have some issues. I've never had to change one, so, you know, you might have to dig into that. I'm just kind of giving you some troubleshooting ideas, not necessarily the exact way to come at that or fix that or change it. So, because again, I haven't had to ever do that. You know, your thermostat, you're going to take out the 2 bolts. You're going to see a thermostat in there, should look familiar to you if you've ever done one before, and put a new one in, seal it accordingly if it has a gasket or you know, silicone sealant before you put that back in, maybe even on the threads of the bolts, some people do, whatever you're comfortable with and experience has told you. So the line going up to, let's see, did I get everything? Thermostat, sensor, reservoir. Okay, the line from the bottom of your reservoir is what this is right here on your cap. So again, things heat up, this expands or contracts accordingly, opening up, you know, allowing, I believe if it gets hot, it probably, you know, pushes upward. and then allowing fluid to escape out that to the overflow reservoir. So if you have a cap that's not functioning properly, that can contribute to overheating as well. Sorry, interrupted by a phone call there. So again, with the cap, if it's not functioning properly, the heat has nowhere to expand to, and it just keeps getting hotter and hotter, and you know, obviously you're going to get an overheating situation. So you can test your cap. You can put it in hot water. Temperature range is usually around 180, 200. You know, don't hold me to that. There's probably a way to confirm by looking up the part number on your particular machine and finding out what that temperature range is. But again, if you go over that, you drop it in that bubbling water, you should see it open. And then when things cool off, you should see it close. That's one way you can test that. There's also a way to pressure test it. In the owner's manual, I'm not well versed enough in that to explain that to you, but if you have an owner's manual, you can look that up if you think your cap is the issue. I apologize for not getting too deep into that. This is your heat sensor here, back here, at least on this one. And on other machines, it may be down in the corner on the left or the right, depending on what year, make, and model you have. And that's just, it gets to a temperature and it sends a signal, turns the fan on. And that's just with wires. And you can test that the same. You could disconnect it from the radiator, put that in hot water, see if your fan comes on, or you can do this. Go find the jumper. You can disconnect it from there, so now you're not depending on that opening and closing with your temperature in order to trigger it to make the fan go on. You just put a jumper on there, and I'm just going to put this in the tripod so I can have my hands free. All right, hands free. So again, I'm unplugging that from there, and this is for the fan. And I just made a two-bladed deal here, just a piece of wire with two blades on it. I mean, you could even just stick the wires in there if you don't have those. One in there, one in there. I'm going to go, just when I turn the key now, the fan should just come on. And if it doesn't, if you're having fan issues, this should reveal that. So here we go. Blowing like it should. So that's how you can test your fan, one of two ways. The other way being to put the sensor in hot water and see if it kicks your fan on. But again, if your fan's not working, there's an issue and why it would cause overheating. So that's the cap and the fan. Then another issue you can have is your water pump. And I apologize, I'm not pulling that off for demonstrating on this video. There's no issue with mine. I don't want to have any gasket issues or anything and having to rehook that up. But it's pretty simple, and I've seen guys come at it a couple of different ways. I've seen some guys take, the bolts out, pull that off. I've also seen guys have this off for the purpose of spinning their flywheel and seeing if the impeller spins. If your impeller is not spinning, and if you're not familiar with that, it looks kind of like a propeller, but with blades on it, and as that spins, it's driven by the motor. As that spins, it sucks water in and forces water out. And if that's not spinning, well, there's an issue there. I don't ever pull that off. I don't see any need, because they were doing that just to spin the flywheel. Well, once you have that off, assuming nothing else is obstructing you from removing it, if you have a different configuration here than I do, if you pull that off, you can just pull your rope and you'll see the impeller spin as you pull the rope. That's the same as spinning the flywheel. That's all you're doing. So, but I mean, if you have a reason to take that off too, go for it. But if the only purpose of taking it off is to access that, you don't really need to, at least as far as I know. I haven't had to change a water pump on this particular model, and I apologize if somebody dives in on that and discovers differently. But if you do, it's not a big deal. There's only, several bolts. I think there's 9 if I remember correctly, and then that cover comes off. But I don't see anything that would be obstructing it or intermingling with the casting or anything. But anyways, so, and always, of course, check all your hoses, make sure they're not brittle, too stiff, cracked, any leaks. Once you tighten everything up, check all that. But those are the most common issues that can cause overheating. And, as long as you know how to test those things and troubleshoot them a little bit, you just kind of start with the most obvious things that aren't going to cause you a great deal of time, labor, and money. Testing the fan is very simple. Checking your coolant level is pretty simple. Making sure that the coolant is exchanging, to demonstrate the thermostat functioning. And I'll show you that when I fill back up, what that would look like. But those are kind of the things though, you know. Hopefully that's helpful. And I'm gonna go back to filling stuff back up here, and then we'll fire it up, and you know, talk about burping it and getting the air out of the system. That is another thing also that can cause overheating, is air in the system. It causes, I don't know if vapor lock is the proper term, but it causes a lack of circulation if you get too much air in there. So we'll get it filled back up, fire things up, and if I think of any other nuggets, I'll of course share them with you. And a real quick demo on how to take this off, because I kind of glossed over that. It's just 2 Torx bolts holding this reservoir on. And then I'm going to eliminate spilling it all over the place, I'm going to disconnect the line or hose from up top and then just feed it through here. That way I don't have to, well, easier said than done, I guess, huh? Yeah, it's got a zip tie on there, so I'm not going to do that. I am, however, real quick, if I can do it without this thing spilling everywhere, I'm going to grab a drain pan and just empty it out into the drain pan. Then I'll disconnect this from the bottom. But that was what I was planning to do was, whoop, yep, don't want to go up higher than your connection up there. Let me just reconnect this one bolt. If you go up higher than the radiator, it's going to drain out the line up top. But I will do this way. And I'll kind of go over the parts of this real quick, but just to make it simple, you got your pressure relief valve in the cap. There's a tiny little pinhole, and if this thing were to build up so much pressure that it had nowhere else to go, it would start squirting out the top. And you also have this piece in there. It could be different. Yours might be different color. I've had yellow on others. So I'm just draining this out. Again, just to do a thorough coolant exchange change. And I'm actually going to clean that out too. I don't know how well you can see in there, but there's a bunch of sediment in there. Looks like silt. And it's just a matter of unscrewing it from the thing. And then after refilling the other part, you know, I'll top this off to the fill line, but I'm going to rinse that out. Anyways, that's how you take that off. Kind of skipped over that, sorry about that. Alright, so cleaned it all out, rinsed it out with some distilled water, not tap water. Just kind of scrubbed off the outside a little bit, get that sediment out of there. You know, now's a good time to do it while everything's empty. Of course, after you do this, you're going to want to, you know, check it to make sure that that's not a source of a leak. You know, and then just put your 2 screws back in and you're good to go there. And top it off after you've topped off your radiator, and if I can find the hole there. There we go. One more screw. And there that is. So that's how you do that. I'll clean that cap off a little better once I get it. And I'll torque those down a little more with the socket. But then next thing to do is fill it up, fill everything up. All right, time to refill. Taking off my cap, I like to use a funnel, it's much less messy. I've made sure my plug is re-tightened on there, reservoir's hooked back up, water pump's tightened back up. I've mixed this coolant. It usually comes pre-mixed at 50-50 or 100% strength. I bought a bottle, or I had about a half a bottle of 50-50, and I poured in the other half of 100% strength. And this is a ethylene glycol coolant, which is what's recommended for anything with an aluminum engine on it. And I Googled it as well, and all Polaris recommends the ethylene glycol. The other type, from what I understand, there's 2 types, propylene glycol and ethylene glycol. And ethylene glycol is the one. Lots of different brands are made of that. It's supposed to be more compatible with aluminum parts and things of that nature. So again, I mixed it. I had about half a gallon of this. This is compatible with, it says, most other coolants, colors, etc. I don't know what was in here before. It was green. Most green coolants are ethylene glycol. There are a few that I found that were not, but the brands were kind of off-brand, so I'm pretty confident they had the right stuff in. So I'm using one that's compatible with most other coolants, because again, I didn't do a complete flush, which I rarely do, and then I know I won't be introducing this into something that's incompatible. So I'm going to start pouring this in here, and it's going to be a little bit different than what I'm accustomed to. Usually I jack up the front end, and I may do that still with this, and it helps kind of burp the system. But if you have a hose on the bottom, that's the case. Both of these hoses are on top, which is kind of an unusual configuration to me anyways. Some of you might be used to that or accustomed to that. So I'm going to fill it up, let it trickle through the hoses a little bit a few times. A few things you can do to burp it if you have a hose on the bottom. Well, just in general, I may still do this. I haven't jacked it up yet, but I may still. Put it up on some ramps, jack it up, get the front end nice and high, almost to the point where if the radiator's full, some might spill out a little bit as you're filling it up. Once you get it to that point, you're gonna squeeze your hoses and stuff, try to work out any free air that might be in there, or I guess it'd be trapped air, not free air, to get that out of there, because air in the system can cause circulation issues and also contribute to overheating. Once you get it filled up and you run it with the cap off, you should see things circulate. I'm just kind of letting this trickle a little bit, and I'll add a little bit more, keep topping it off until it trickles through the hoses. You know, I kind of got to fill this radiator all the way to the top just about before it gets to the hose level, and we'll start going into those, which it is doing. I don't know if you can hear it percolating through there. And then I'll start it up. You'll see the level drop as the thermostat opens, again assuming everything is functioning properly. And you know, I'll demonstrate that for you. I'll show you when the coolant level drops and the thermostat opens. So if you're just trying to test your thermostat, you can at least see what that is like and what you should see visually. So that's kind of topped off there. I'm going to start this thing up and see if I can get it to start circulating, and then add as needed as it drops down. So bear with me. I need to go crack the door too so I don't asphyxiate myself. 1 second. Okay, a couple of things here real quick. So I brought it up to temperature just so you wouldn't have to sit here watching, waiting for it to get there. And while I was running it, you know, some air worked out of the system. And again, if this was a different setup, if both hoses were on the bottom, I would definitely jack the front end up to assist with bleeding air out and making sure I didn't get vapor lock in there, air bubble trapped low in the system somewhere. But if I give it some gas now, you're going to see there's two holes. There's a hole right here. I don't know, well, you can see that, but there's a hole right there, and that's for your overflow exchange in and out as needed. And then below this coolant line at the moment, there's another hole. And when I rev it, you're going to see the coolant level drop a little bit, and you're going to see a stream of coolant coming back, which will indicate circulation, obviously. So here, let's show you that. Hopefully you're able to see that. So that indicates to me that I have circulation, which would mean, of course, my thermostat is opening and my water pump is working. So I think I'm okay with this. I hate to oversimplify it because it can be a little troublesome with other setups, particularly, turn this off, particularly setups that have the hose on the bottom. You know, you're going to want to jack up your front end and introduce the coolant to help work that air out. You know, and a lot of times people rock it back and forth, things like that. In a car, I've always just filled it up, ran it, turned on the heat, and just kept adding fluid every time the thermostat opened. But on this went much smoother than it can typically go. So I wish I could have recreated some problems for you to demonstrate, but for this 1999 Sportsman 500 with this setup and the two hoses on top, it went pretty well. I just kept pouring it in and it would trickle into those hoses. I massaged the hoses a bit to work out any air, but and to the point where as I was doing it, all that was happening was coolant was, you know, coming back up out of the, towards the cap or towards the opening. I would see the fluid level rise and no more air coming out. Then I ran it, and I saw a little bit of air coming when I'd rev it, a little bit of air coming. But after you do that, you know, obviously you want to check your fluid, you know, the first few times. You should always check it, but more importantly, check it, you know, after the first few times you ride and work some air out and stuff, and especially if you find you're getting an overheating problem, you want to monitor that. So that was pretty much, that was a pretty simple situation for this setup. Doesn't always go that smoothly, so hopefully it goes that smoothly for you. So anyways, I'm going to put the cap back on here. I'm going to fill up my overflow reservoir to the appropriate line on the side there. All right, so I'm going to fill this up real quick. And then after I'm done with that, I'm going to go over just one more time, summarize troubleshooting issues. That way, if anybody wants to, they can just kind of, and I'm sure I didn't cover everything. I sure tried to cover as much as I could think of. If you can think of anything and chime in. Their funnel was just too much, having trouble getting past the shut-off valve there. So again, I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing my own personal experiences and hoping that you can benefit from it. If anybody thinks of anything I missed, please comment in the comments and, you know, share that with other people. I'm going to kind of bullet point, like I said, go over everything one more time. One thing I did not mention, if all the other things that you check just don't produce any results or solve your issues, worst case scenario, when you have an overheating problem, you know, you could always have a bad head gasket, you know, and that's an extreme situation, of course. And one of the symptoms of that would indicate that typically is a loss of power. If your machine is overheating and it just feels sluggish, like you just don't have the oomph you once had, you know, it's a potential indicator for that. Not 100% for sure, that's the problem, but you could probably lean in that direction. So I filled it between the min and max line. I'll probably about right to just a hair below the max. I'm gonna ride a little bit and bounce it around a little bit and see if the level goes down and I need to add any more, and you should do the same, of course. But we'll go over everything here again real quick about troubleshooting. And I don't know if I mentioned it. I know I started mentioning that I mixed that coolant about half a gallon of 50/50 and then another half a gallon of 100% strength. And that, in my challenged math abilities, I came up with that should end up with about a 75% strength, 75 coolant, 25% distilled water. In my thought process is I keep this stored in an area in Alaska where it gets well below zero, and that 75, I think if you mix 60/40, it's rated for like, I think -30 or something like that. And this area can get colder than that. And I don't want to, in the spring, pull this thing out and find leaks because the likelihood is slim, but I'm increasing my chances of a better, more successful storage by strengthening that concentration a little bit. Anyways, so just going through troubleshooting some of the stuff, again, just in case anybody skipped ahead, or I know I covered a few things from a few different angles, but I'll just summarize it all one more time. For overheating issues, I think we've covered the changing the coolant, but again, I'll start on this side because that's where I am. Thermostat is under here. If you do not have circulation in your radiator, your thermostat could be bad, and you can either just swap that out, or you could test it. You could take it out, put it in a pan of boiling water, and see if it opens, and then when cools, closes, or vice versa. That's one thing. That's a relatively cheap part. It's 2 bolts right there. And again, a lot of these symptoms for a lot of the things can be similar for each, and you just got to kind of troubleshoot and go through, see what makes the most sense for what's going on with yours, and, you know, just go through process of elimination sometimes. Sometimes the symptoms make it obvious. For example, your heat sensor on the engine block here, that is what regulates your temperature or check engine light to come on your console. So if you start your machine up and it hasn't even had an opportunity to get to running temperature yet, normal running temperature, or you just turn it on, start it, and your your temp light or check engine light on is on automatically, you know, or just on all the time, chances are you could have a bad temperature sensor. If coolant is squirting out the top of your overflow reservoir here, things are getting so hot that it's going through the radiator, the cap is triggering to open to then allow coolant to go into here, and it's just getting so hot that it's just squirting out the top, and that's, you know, that's bad. And if that's happening, you know, there's a lot of things that can contribute to that as well. And I guess before I even dive into all those details, one of the first things you should check when you have an overheating situation, in my opinion, is that your radiator's not plugged up with mud. I've had that situation, and I took the wheeler down to a river, faced it into the current, and just let the water run through it, and grabbed a solo cup and just kept splashing the radiator and rubbing it, and eventually it worked itself out enough, and it was an immediate improvement. I no longer had the overheating issue. So always check that. If you're riding through mud and stuff, that's a very common cause of overheating. Clean your radiator. Don't be poking at it with sharp stuff and putting holes in it, you know, garden hose, or some people say compressed air. I've always been a little bit leery of that, but you know, it could be all right. But an easy test for that is just, especially if you have your wheeler in a dark area, put a light behind it and just look through the front. And if you don't see any light shining through, or you'll see the areas of concern that are plugged, and address that. So that's a simple, very cheap fix. Let's see what else. So I've covered the thermostat, heat sensor, overflow reservoir, and again, that's for as things heat up, the coolant expands in your radiator. It's got to go somewhere instead of blowing up your radiator. Comes in here, cools, and then as things cool off and the capacity of the radiator changes because the coolant contracts, then it will suck some of this back in there and back and forth as needed if all is functioning properly. So that's that. And then again, radiator, check that. I'm not going to take my cap off because that's hot, but you could have a bad cap. If your cap's not functioning properly, you aren't allowing the coolant to expand into the overflow reservoir, which is what its purpose is. So that's not functioning properly if your cap's not working good. Or if you have, say, a bad fitting cap, or the mouth of your radiator that the cap goes on is distorted and it's not getting a good seal. Those are all things to look at. And then the fan, you got your heat sensor there for the temperature of the coolant in the radiator. The other one tests the temperature of the coolant in the block. This tests the temperature of the coolant in the radiator and then turns your fan on accordingly. And I showed earlier in there how you can test that. Whoops, dropping stuff. You can, I jumped that, and again, it's earlier in the video, I'm not going to do it again. Take that off, bypassing the switch and just making a direct connection. Because this is just kind of like opening and closing a circuit. You pull that off. I'll pull it off for you, but I'm not going to jump it and demonstrate it. You got, you know, 2 plugs there, 2 female plugs there. Just jump it, put a wire in there, a wire in there. It's one piece of wire connecting them, and you should be able to just turn on your key. You don't even have to run the machine. Turn on your key, and it will. Your fan should go on immediately. So that can be a problem if your fan's not functioning also. Coming down here, of course, always check all your connections, make sure you're not leaking. You know, squeeze your hoses, make sure they're not stiff, cracked. If you have cracks or leaks anywhere, that can introduce air into the system. Air in the system can be a big source of overheating. And then, of course, you have your water pump. Again, this is a 99 Sportsman 500. Yours may look different, maybe in slightly different location. There's an impeller in there, which is kind of like a propeller or a paddle boat wheel, or paddle boat wheel, and that should spin. And if it is not spinning, it's not doing its job. And on this model, I believe, I haven't done it and haven't had the need, but just looking at it, I believe I can just take the bolts off and pull that off to expose the impeller. And after doing so, then you can just give your rope a little bit of a pull, and you'll see if the impeller spins as you turn the motor. You know, some people have taken that off. I've seen them hand spin the flywheel, but they might have been doing other stuff too. I don't know that they took it off just to do that. They may have had to take that off in order to expose full access to their water pump. I don't know. I'm not second guessing that. I'm just giving those as options. You know, people can commonly be doing multiple projects at once, and you know what you see may not. You know, just like I have all my plastics off, I'm doing all kinds of stuff. It makes it much easier for you to see what's going on there again. So again, before you fill it up, of course, tighten up your plug, or you know, make sure your hose clamps are tight, and don't over tighten them, especially on the plastic radiator. You don't want to distort the connection and, you know, misshape it, because that can potentially restrict the flow or inhibit the flow or modify the flow in an unfavorable manner, and or crack the plastic. So hopefully that kind of covers a lot of stuff there for you. I'm sure there's something that I missed. Apologize if I did. Always ask questions if you need clarification on something. Again, I'm not an expert, just sharing my personal experience and the limited knowledge that I have in hopes that it helps people. And a bunch of people had asked me in comments if I would do one specifically on a coolant change, so I was doing it, so I made the video. So anyways, kind of a long one again. I realize kind of another deep dive, but people seem to appreciate that. I know when I find those, I find them informative and helpful, and appreciate the effort. So there you go. That's that one. And on to the next one. Thanks for watching.